and foresight on the head of the department. Welcome. But also because we love Laura and she's wonderful. She's a great concept. And we're delighted to have her. She does such great work. She chaired this 2 weeks ago, the previous Minister for Social Development. Thank you so much. I'm sitting at the back. I'll have to leave in about 40 minutes. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to it.
How are you doing? Good? Some of you should come down here. Room. It's nicer for the speaker. There is this law about crowds. I'm sitting far back. Always sitting far back.
Do you know Patrick O'Brien? Do you know Patrick O'Brien?
From here?
Yeah.
Yeah. He wasn't he in?
He's very old now.
Yeah.
But,
did he say he would come?
I sent him an email saying I was doing it because I knew him in the distant past.
Yeah, because he's retired some time ago.
Yes. I think he's 93.
Yeah.
So
I haven't seen him. I mean, once you mentioned him, was he in our government or our sociology department?
No, he was an economic historian.
Oh, he was in economic. That's right. No, I think he's not been around for quite some time.
Yes.
The reason I remember him being around is because I've been around here too long. I couldn't invite something. I yelled it out. Some of them would come down.
I think it's okay.
So you just have to remember there's a peanut gallery.
I think it is because there's a note that says if it's after 4, they should sit upstairs. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Cutting Edge lecture series in the Development Department at the LSE. I'm Laura Mann. I'm an associate professor in the department and the convener of this year's series. Today we're going to be revisiting the kind of debates around the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the West with Professor Michael Mann from the UCLA. Before we begin, I have to go through my little spiel that this session is being recorded and it will be available both on YouTube and a podcast. For that reason, we would like you to turn off or mute your mobile phones. And third of all, in the extremely unlikely event of a fire, I need to tell you that the assembly point for the old theatre is outside of the Sorsui Hock building, and we will guide you there. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. So first of all, we have Michael Mann, who is a distinguished research professor in the Sociology department of the UCLA in Los Angeles. He's the author of many books, including The Sources of Social Power, volumes 1 through 4, Incoherent Empire, which is a book looking at the US foreign policy on the eve of the Iraq War, Fascists, and The Dark Side of Democracy, explaining ethnic cleansing. His most recent book is On Wars, which came out last year and looks at the reasons that states go to war. So he's currently writing a piece that's critically revisiting debates on the origins of the Industrial Revolution, which he's going to share with you tonight, and it's a work in progress, so he's very keen to hear your comments. In addition to being a distinguished author of many books, he's actually also my father, so I can say that he's also a very kind father, and I feel a little bit like I'm bringing my parent into work today. So please be kind. So to join us as a discussant, we have our colleague, Professor James Putzel, who I think many of you know is the program director of the Development Studies degree in our department and the convener of the core course. He's also well known for his book, A Captive Land, The Politics of Agrarian Reform in the Philippines. And he's also worked and is known for his work on the Crisis State Research Center at the LSE, which studied the processes through which states and societies collapse into violence in war and recover from it. He also knows his way in and out of debates surrounding the Industrial Revolution, and so he's going to be an excellent discussant to start off the Q&A today. So we're going to let Michael Mann speak for 45 minutes to an hour, and then James is going to make some comments, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Michael Mann.
I'll go down.
Are you ready?
Well, thank you for this opportunity for me to air my first thoughts on current work that I'm doing on the Industrial Revolution. Now, obviously, the Industrial Revolution is one of the most dramatic periods of human history when societies stopped being agrarian, subject to Malthusian cycles, and instead we had industrialization. Now I'm focusing especially on the period 1760 to about 1840, and that's the kind of key period of the Industrial Revolution, when the inventions were made and where they were put to marketable use. Obviously, the lives of people in Britain, and it was in Britain that it occurred first, the lives of ordinary people were not all that transformed at first, and certainly there was no enormous surge in productivity or anything like that, but the base was clearly built in this period for the subsequent exponential growth of the British and then other economies. Now, what I'm going to do is try and explain this in terms of my model of sources of social power. Now, as you can see, societies consist of networks of ideological, economic, military, and political power. these are the four main ways in which people can get together and achieve things together that they could not achieve separately, and that's collective power. At the same time, these sources of power give opportunities to elites who control it to exercise distributive power, power over others. So we have power with and power over. And these, I think, are the essential structures of human society. Now, each of them has a kind of one or more kind of logics of development, some kind of steadiness, some growth, development, and the like. Of course, we're very familiar with classical economics, which regards that internal logic as being all-encompassing. But Marxist modes of production are an alternative. In military power, we find that the capacity to kill and devastate has grown steadily and more recently exponentially in human history. And that whether you win or lose wars has a big impact on subsequent development. I use my notion of despotic and infrastructural power to deal with political power. And in terms of ideologies, in this period, I am concerned with religion and with science as an ideology. Ideological power proceeds from our impossibility as human beings to derive ultimate truth from our practical experience or indeed from our science. And then the big gap between them is filled by ideologies which give plausible explanations of the meaning of life and morality and the like. And that is the essence of ideological power. Now, these internal developments are thrown off course or reinforced by conjunctures with the other sources and also with nature. I'll explain nature later on. So I'm going to specify the logics and the conjunctures causing the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And I'll try and also, in each phase, talk about counterfactuals, how there might have been alternative routes or not to the Industrial Revolution. Now, Europe before 1500, about, was a single ideological entity, Christendom, where the church was the major source of morality, and it also legitimated the extraction of surplus, massive amounts, by churches and by the lords. And the agrarian society was one of subsistence, where a peasant family had to store about 1/3 of their grain, of the grain that they produced, in order to plant it the following year. If they didn't do that, they died next year. And sometimes, if they were forced to live on more of it, they died this year. Italy had was a kind of leader in this period because of its links with the superior civilizations of Islam and Asia. But the point about the Middle Ages and right up to 1500 and beyond, the main interest is that wars and martial values were baked in to European society. Wars were almost continuous for every conceivable motive you can think of, and martial values were regarded as very high honors. And in this process, the bigger states swallow the smaller states. And war with the swallowing up of smaller states, war becomes steadily more costly, putting more pressure on states, which remain infrastructurally weak, but they do deals in order to get taxes and debt and take out debts with lords and cities in order to pay for wars. But there's no sign of any breakthrough. In the 16th century, Christendom breaks apart. Now, there is a logic of churches which generate heresies, so do political movements, and that is was a continuous process of the Catholic Church through the European period. You know, what did Christ really mean? What did Karl Marx really mean? And ideological movements have this interior tendency to fracture over the core beliefs. But in this case, unlike heretics from the Albigensians to the Hussites, Protestants endured and became extremely powerful. Why? Well, because of several conjunctures. Firstly, a geopolitical struggle. Smaller German states were resisting the power of the Holy Roman Empire, which was allied to the papacy. And so the German smaller states embraced Protestantism as a sign of resistance to that. And then this spread further north and westwards, and we have more states declaring for Protestantism, or at least there were intense fights within them, with Protestants finally victorious. So the religious schism became much more important than anything before. But secondly, there were shifts in power towards the West. The Atlantic trade was replacing the Mediterranean. Spain and Portugal were being replaced by the Dutch, and then the English at sea. And then thirdly, there's the agricultural revolution just beginning. Iron plows are invented, enabling the turnover of the heavier soils of Northern Europe. By aerating them, they become more productive than the lightest soils around the Mediterranean. So that there's a shift of economic power. And capitalism is, well, they're intensifying. It's actually appearing in this period. And so we get the Weber versus Marx argument about the correlation of religion and emerging capitalism. Emerging religion, emerging capitalism. They both emerged at the same time. So it's difficult to have a simple causal theory of one being older than the others. That's in contrast to the geopolitical struggle, which had started much earlier and older. Well, I prefer not to see the relationship between Protestantism and capitalism as a direct correlation, because their conjuncture is mediated through geopolitics, politics, and nature, right? The heavy soil has always been there. It was a hindrance before, now it's a benefit. So the timeliness of nature has a big impact on things. The counterfactual is, would the Industrial Revolution be possible without capitalism? And I think the answer to that is no. But the question that intrigues me is whether without Protestantism it would have, the Industrial Revolution would have appeared. Now, the rise of Europe is generally treated as process of a great divergence between Europe, China, and India. That is, when Europe overtakes the Asian powers. But recent economic historians have added a prelude to that, which they call a little divergence. And that is the emergence of the Netherlands, and then, after quite a substantial pause, of England, Britain. So the question arises, why didn't the Dutch reach an industrial revolution? They were one of the last European powers to develop it, after France, after Germany, after Belgium. Why didn't it happen there? There are some economic arguments put forward by economic historians. By and large, economic historians emphasize economic phenomena. And they argue that coal, which Britain had in abundance, was better as a source of energy than peat, which the Dutch had in abundance. And the Dutch stayed with wind power. They had plenty of windmills, and didn't move to steam, which of course was one of the two key industries of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And there's obviously some truth in those. But I think that the political and military conjuncture is dominant. There were in this period trade wars. That's real wars. We talk about trade wars today as tariffs and that kind of thing. But the trade wars of the 16th, 17th, 18th century were wars where lots of people got killed. The Navigation Acts were acts forcing other powers by the use of your naval power to put their trade in British ships. Britain wasn't the only way of doing that. It wasn't the only power doing that, but Britain took it much further. And there were 4 Anglo-Dutch wars. The Dutch had the better of the first 2. The third one, because Britain allied with France, went their way. And the 4th Anglo-Dutch War between Britain and the Dutch was a comprehensive victory for Britain. So, why not the Netherlands? We haven't yet said why Britain. It's primarily a whole series of military defeats which exhaust their treasuries and lead to decline. Why? Well, there is a natural a feature of nature which is important, is that Britain was 2 islands, because of course it was Ireland was within British control in that period. And so as long as Britain had a navy, it couldn't be invaded, though there were several attempts to do so. And to the west was open seas, no rival at all. And so nature greatly helped British development. The Dutch, on the other hand, were threatened at sea by Britain, but on land by France and Spain. The southern Netherlands then was controlled by the Spanish Empire. So wars were a lot more expensive for the Dutch than for the British. And by 1780, the British Royal Navy was had twice the number of ships as the Dutch did, and their tonnage, displacement tonnage, was 3 times larger. So the victory of Britain was obviously coming. Now, in both countries, there were representative institutions. The Dutch went deeper down the class structure than the British. But in the Netherlands, each province had its own parliament, its own assembly, whereas there was one national parliament in Britain, which made for a much more cohesive foreign policy, what was called blue water policy in Britain, and a set of policies that were different province by province. And those provinces which weren't threatened by France or Spain refused to pay taxes to support wars. And so the Dutch couldn't use all the resources that they had. Of course, the Dutch were then defeated by Napoleon, who occupied the Netherlands and forced the Dutch to pay for the cost of the occupation army, which was the final straw, and the Dutch state went bankrupt. But of course, since Napoleon ultimately failed, his defeat left Britain unchallenged at sea and with trade. Now, the counterfactual here is, could the Dutch have developed industrial revolution? And I think the answer is no. Too many changes would have been required, including natural changes. France, it might have been possible if Napoleon had been totally victorious, but somewhat unlikely. Now we come to the first phase of the Industrial Revolution. We see as early as 1710, half the population are working in industry, but you mustn't think of factories. It's household, cottage industry, putting out practices. But these are people who are not working in agriculture, and so the agriculture has become more productive and able to support the other half who are producing goods. And by 1750, it's clear that Malthus is now wrong, and that it's possible to have economic growth without population growth swallowing it up. Now, there are also arguments about the role of politics, of political power, associated with Douglas North, and also now, more recently, with Acemoglu and his colleagues. And North stressed 1688 as a date, which was the Glorious Revolution, known as the Glorious Revolution, whereby William of Orange and Mary Stuart were the joint monarchs, and the religious issue was finally decided. And it wasn't property rights, as North says, because property rights were there for a couple of hundred years earlier. It's rather that a single parliament with now no significant differences between the rival factions, that is, the dispute between Parliament and the King is over, there's been a compromise, and that leads to the political unity of the dominant classes. And it is the dominant classes and others who do achieve the Industrial Revolution. So that unity of the propertied classes is what helps the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And it goes along with increasing state infrastructural power. Now, the counterfactual is, could this economy and state, the British late 17th century economy and state, have reached the Industrial Revolution? And I think the answer is no. More was needed, as we will see. But these were necessary steps. And now we have the core period of the Industrial Revolution, the high technology section. Now, economists tend to stress the logic of economic capitalist development. There are many variants of that. Robert Allen says that trade growth enabled substitution of technology and coal, cheap energy, for high-wage labor. So this is a kind of economic orthodoxy of factors of production. And it's innovation generated by response to entrepreneurial demands. These are kind of recognizably conventional economic arguments. Others dispute this, point out that the cotton industry developments are about bottlenecks in production rather than economizing on labor. But the economists tend all to share the view that it's the demand of entrepreneurs that generates the supply of inventions. Well, now, as I've said, military power was baked in, and baked into British policy as well. Colonial and trade wars are the essence of the 18th century. Britain's natural advantage was that it only faced a threat at sea, and navies were a lot cheaper than armies, and they suffered far fewer casualties. The 4 Anglo-Dutch wars, in total, about 10,000 died on each side. Right? A single land war in Europe in the 18th century, say the War of the Spanish Succession or the Austrian Succession, these killed 400,000 people and obviously devastated the battle zones. Whereas when you're fighting at sea, there's no damage to your own territory. So these are important advantages for Britain, given the nature of the warfare. Of course, an important part of the profits made from empire depended on slavery. Most slaves were carried in British ships. The British were not themselves slavers in Africa. They relied on African chiefs and Arab traders, but the British carried the vast bulk of slaves to the New World. And the second point is that Britain's major imports all use slave labor in the colonies. Cotton, silver, which was important for export to China, tobacco and sugar. And these came in from the colonies where they were produced by slaves and exchanged for manufacturing exports, which obviously boosted the British economy and it boosted city growth. Now, Deirdre McCloskey has argued that imperialism is stupid and that British people didn't benefit. But it's not the British people who are initiating the policies, carrying them out, and benefiting from them. It's the wealthy. It's for the classes represented in Parliament. So this is a parliamentary system, cutting down the powers of the monarch, but it represents exclusively the wealthy classes, perhaps 2% of the population. The taxes that the British state got to pay for war were excise taxes on consumption, putting prices up, and they harmed the poor more than the rich. Just as Donald Trump's policies, if he gets his way with tariffs, that they will harm the poor more than they will harm the rich. And the other form of source payment for empire was the interest on the debt. that is, the propertied classes in general, lent money to the British state with an interest rate guaranteed. And fairly uniquely among the European states, they all got paid. So it was an ideal form of safe investment. So those with money made more money out of the debt system. When slavery was abolished in the British Empire in the 1830s, slave owners were compensated £20 million, which would be about 5 billion in today's money. And payments were made through time to the slave owners and their descendants, and their descendants. It's only in 2015 that British taxpayers are not paying money to the descendants of slave owners. It's quite striking. If you go to the Bank of England Museum in London, you'll find this documented. And those taxpayers include me, so I was paying slave owners. Of course, the slaves have not received any compensation at all. Well, McCloskey also says that the imports from empire are quite a low proportion of the whole British economy, but that's because half of the economy is still agrarian, and it's a bigger proportion, much bigger proportion in the modern sectors, especially cotton, which was one of the two core industries of the Industrial Revolution. So empire did boost towards, it did offer a boost towards the Industrial Revolution, but not to the prosperity of the British people. The counterfactual is, if you had an Industrial Revolution without, could you have an Industrial Revolution without imperialism? Well, in principle, if actually all of the nations agreed to free trade, but in practice, no. If Britain didn't do it, someone else would be extracting resources from British ships. Now, another great discontinuity in Europe in the 17th century was science, the scientific revolution. I haven't seen entirely convincing explanations of why this occurred, though there are conventional views that the voyages of the Europeans around the world made them see superior Chinese and Islamic science, and superior to the Greek and Roman philosophies that the Europeans were operating with. They saw that the Greeks and Romans were wrong about the continents, wrong about the skies, and wrong about the Earth's motion. And what was called natural philosophy, which we would call science, and mathematics will reveal God's laws. And science was increasingly a god of the gaps, that is, the gaps between our certain knowledge and our practical knowledge would be filled with laws, but these laws were what God had put there. And so science was a kind of theology in this early period. Also relevant is that the invention of printing in the late 15th century accelerated in the following century, and resulted in a highly literate set of elites, especially Protestants, because the essence of Protestantism was read the Bible. And if you read the Bible, you don't have to believe what the priest says, you can make your own interpretation. And that's why Protestantism generated many, many different sects, because once you allow people to decide what Jesus meant, then you're going to get many different answers. And so the scientific revolution is encouraged by the widespread diffusion of books and journals with new ideas, with mathematical formula, and with experiments. And it becomes increasingly Protestant. It also splits into two main wings, the scientific revolution. The rationalism, embodied especially by Descartes, and the empiricism represented by Isaac Newton. And empirical research and experiments came to dominate Britain and lowland Scotland, which were, of course, Protestant. Now, is this important for the Industrial Revolution? Well, some authors, Mokyr and Jack Goldstone, they see direct links to the inventions of the Industrial Revolution and the inventors and science. What they call, it's an industrial enlightenment. Now, Robert Allen says, no, he says it's tinkering artisans who produce the inventions. So there's a kind of dispute here about ideological versus economic power. Now, Robert Allen performs a great service in analyzing the biographies of 79 inventors. And he concludes that half were influenced by science and half were artisan tinkerers. This is slightly odd, since he comes down for the artisan tinkerer rather than it's 50-50. They both contribute. There are three levels of invention identified by Mokyr. The inventors themselves, James Watts and Trevithick and Samuel Crompton, and these people. And then there were the tweakers, the people who improved on their machines, and James Watt had about 4 people who were doing that. And then what Mokyr calls the makers, who were the people who made it marketable, who made this new machine able to sell it on the market and to be in operation in an industry. But the total, Mokyr says, must be in the thousands of inventors, though we don't know most of them. There are no records, but his assumption is there are thousands, and it's a mass movement. Now, there were many ideological infrastructures of science in Britain. There was the Royal Society itself, set up by Robert Boyle, whereby all the latest discoveries were published, and inventors were rewarded with membership of the Royal Society. There was the patent system, the Lunar Society of Birmingham, the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society, many more institutes. Each town would have its own institute. There were libraries, there were books, pamphlets. There were traveling lecturers who were not only lecturing but also doing experiments. And there's a very famous one painting by Joseph Wright of Derby, who was the painter of the Industrial Revolution, and of a bird in a vacuum. And people watching and realizing that the bird is gradually going to die, and there are different expressions that dominate the painting. There was also something called the Lady's Diary, which was aimed at upper-class ladies, and the editor, the main editor, Henry Byton, is one of Allen's inventors, and he would regularly put in mathematical questions, and there was a competition, and the ladies competed in the answer. Of course, all of the inventors were men, but the upper-class ladies felt that they had to know something about science, which indicates the importance, the widespread importance of science in this period. There were also general skills. That is, you know, Samuel Crompton is there in cotton, it's his whole life, never does anything else, he makes a couple of inventions and that's it. And he doesn't have general skills, he has intimate knowledge of the cotton industry. But most of the inventions featured more general skills, and featured especially clockmakers and millwrights who were specialists in gearing, you know, meshing together to create different levels of power, the meshing together like in the gears of a car. And they found that they could use their knowledge, reinforced by Newtonian calculus, to offer inventions across various industries. And indeed, 33% of the inventors made inventors in their own industry, but also 33% of them made inventions in unfamiliar industries, which was partly due to personal interaction and partly to the existence of general principles of mechanical science. Now, the counterfactual here is that there would be no industrial revolution in Britain without these innovators. And the innovations became unstoppable. Now, there are various studies of the inventors, together with some brief details of their biographies. You can't get all that many. But nobody has asked what their religion was. So this is the one piece of original research I've done, which is, if you look at the English population in 1760, 94% of the population were Anglicans. Non-conformists, lower church, were 4%. Now, among Allen's inventors, or the 75 of them that I could find data on, half, 49%, were non-conformists. If you add the Scots Presbyterians, who were also mainly Calvinists, it rises to 67%, 2/3. Anglicans were only 30% of the inventors, and if these totals don't add up, it's because there were 3 Catholics and 1 Jew. Why? Is this Weber vindicated? Calvinists pioneering the Industrial Revolution, never mind about the 17th century, the late 18th, beginning of the 19th century. Well, it's not a direct correlation. It's not merely because they believe in a certain reading of the Bible. There are political conjunctures. Non-conformists had supported Cromwell in the Civil War. They had been the core of the Cromwellian army. So when and several of them were regicides, that is, people who participated in the execution of Charles I. So when the Restoration emerged, there was revenge. Non-conformists were barred from offices, from teaching or attending Oxbridge, the only two English universities. Actually, they didn't admit anyone other than Anglicans until the 1870s. You had to sign a document saying you agreed with the 39 articles of the Anglican Church. And most grammar schools were also Anglican. So, like Jews in many European countries, deprived of access to professions and other occupations, dissenters who dissented from the 39 Articles were focused on business. But the third thing is that they founded their own educational system. There were at least 80 academies, which was their name for non-conformist schools. And these academies had a much more modern curricula than Anglican schools and universities, including science. So it's clear that the counterfactual, the Industrial Revolution, would at least have been much slower without the non-conformists, since they were producing 2/3 of the innovations. Which raises interesting questions about human capital, which is, of course, a favorite term of economists. Britain had high labor productivity and a high level of education. There were, as we've seen, 3 schooling routes to invention. One was the apprentice system, the craftsman, the generalist artisans. The second was the Anglican establishment of the Royal Society, Newton, the Patent Office, etc. And the third was the dissenting academies. And the combination was necessary for the Industrial Revolution. And rather interestingly, given the ignorance of the dissenting academies, there are many theories around about the Industrial Revolution of how, to begin with, it's all about capital accumulation, not human capital, and that only develops later. This is specifically, for example, what unified growth theory says. But that's because they don't look at the most important schools, and that the education system was very much in place at the time of the first phase of the Industrial Revolution. So, my conclusion is that all 4 sources were necessary causes of the Industrial Revolution. Now, I have emphasized here, I've emphasized military, political, and ideological features. But of course, I accept that if you're seeking to explain an economic outcome, the most likely causes of this will be the logic of the economy that preceded it. So I haven't talked about that, but I accept that. But I have added that the other 3 sources of social power were necessary for the Industrial Revolution. So that I think that I've offered a theory which lies between the kind of simple, say, economic determinism or cultural determinism on the one hand, and endless multi-causality on the other, which of course many most historians accept multi-causality, but I think one can get a certain understanding of historical developments by looking at the four sources of social power. And I think I'll end there. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm going to bring
Is that working?
I'm going to sit down too, James.
I prefer to stand for
Okay.
my comments because I have to look at. I don't have any projections on the board. Oh, okay, thanks. Michael, thank you so much. You know, I was saying that this is the first time I've met Michael Mann, but I've been reading his work for years, so I'm kind of in awe standing up here with him. Michael has a brilliant corpus of work, you know, and I kind of rediscovered it about 10 years ago, and I want to say something about that because I think it's really relevant to our study of development. You know, he provides this theoretical model of four sources of social power, and you know, economic, military, ideological, and political. And he talked a little bit about how political power is looked at as infrastructural power and despotic power. It's a parsimonious model that he's developed over time through the most extraordinary feat of scholarship. So you go back to, or at least for me anyway, I read an article, and this article, for those of you taking DV 400, is actually on your reading list next term. An article in 1984 in the European Journal of Sociology, where the model was presented in I think, in its first instance, in an article on the discussing the autonomy of the state. And then, you know, with each of the 4 volumes, and these are really big volumes, I can't put them on your reading list because you would complain too much, but I urge you at some point to look at them. But in each successive volume, Michael developed a theory, I think, anyway. Maybe he'll say something different. And I found the successive explanation, elaboration, etc. of the theory, all the way up to the point of this manuscript that he's working on now, which I read a draft of, which is more tightly explained, more succinct in terms of the 4 sources of power. And I want to say that, you know, I think this theoretical framework has stood the test of time. We just had a little bit of an expose of how it can help to explain the Industrial Revolution. And it sort of ages like a really fine whiskey, Michael, that, and we're looking forward. I think we should all look forward to the publication of the book on the Industrial Revolution. I said that I rediscovered the work about 10 years ago. And that's when a number of us began working on this notion of political settlements. It was an effort to try to understand, or an effort in reaction to institutional theory of Douglas North and AJR and whatnot, trying to spotlight the need to understand that institutions embody power, and every state sits on what we call the political settlement, but a particular configuration of power. But you know, in that work on political settlements, it was heavily influenced, again, by economic deterministic propositions of historical political economy. And it was in turning back to Michael's work and looking again, that it helped to give me, anyway, the beginnings of a framework to understand the configurations of power on which, you know, any state rests. So we'll be talking about this in my course anyway next term, but it's a very powerful way to a systematic way to kind of conduct an anatomy of power in society. This framework, if I can say just a little bit more, is really attractive to us who are studying development. Why? Because it allows us a route to explain the multiple causality, which is so important to our field. The logic of the interdisciplinary nature of development studies can really be informed by and taken further through this, what he calls quadrilateral approach to the study of power. So what's so interesting here is that this is a non-deterministic theory, but a rigorous one. So there are causes of the Industrial Revolution, as we just heard, explained, but they were not in any way absolutely deterministic. And this is what we need in terms of understanding both how developing countries got to where they are, how historically development processes unfolded in our rich countries today. So an awful lot, as I mentioned, of our own development, studies of development, either by neoclassical economists or more qualitatively oriented historical political economists, are still kind of hamstrung with economic determinism. And this is one way, I think, that we can get out of it, and it can contribute a lot to our study of development. But also, and I think finally, before I put a couple of questions to you, obviously the substantive content of this talk, the Industrial Revolution and what it was about, is really important to our understanding of development. We're interested in the origin story that Michael is telling. The big debates that still characterize the study of economic history and the study of our times as to why did the Industrial Revolution take place in Europe, why in England. There's a way to counteract the accusations that we sometimes hear of Eurocentrism in the work of Michael. And those questions related to the origin of the Industrial Revolution have to do with central questions which preoccupy us. What's the relationship between agricultural transformation and industrial transformation? What's the role of religion, of science, of culture, of demographics, demographic change, and of military conquest in processes of development? They're there in that story of the Industrial Revolution, that sort of origin story. But for us, there's also a second reason the study of the Industrial Revolution is important, and that's because we're interested in the late industrializers, of the countries that have come up over the last 70, 80 years, facing the challenges of structural change. And some of the same questions of the relationship of agriculture and industry, but also of urbanization without industrialization, the problems of scarcity of energy, or the need to exponentially increase our supply of energy, or the scarcity of water, the constraints of climate change. So these issues are also central to us and derive from a story or from an understanding of the industrial revolutions of the past. And I think we've been weakest in our study of development in understanding ideological power. And this is a really interesting dimension. You spent some time in the talk just now showing us how important this was. At the heart of the manuscript as it exists right now is this, I found, fascinating story about the inventors versus the tinkers. And you got into that a bit towards the end of your talk. The artisans versus the role of the natural philosophers or scientists and mathematicians. And really what we see in this, and Michael's understanding of it, we see, a really important terrain of causation that derives actually from struggles within ideological power. So I think I should stop there, but I want to raise 3 questions maybe, or 3 points that you might take up, but we want to move to all your questions. So the first thing is, I wonder if you want to tell us a little bit more about what you mentioned as the timeliness of nature. I mean, are we just talking about geography, that Britain was, an island state, and this kind of thing? Or is there something more in that idea that you want to explore and develop? Because I found it kind of intriguing possibly in more ways than what I read so far. The second thing is that it occurred to me as I read this account of the Industrial Revolution that this framework could be applied in a very interesting way to understand China's industrialization over the last 40 years. And it's a great project, and maybe some of you want to take a piece of that in your master's dissertation, etc. I would love to work on that project, actually, maybe with Laura. And the third thing has to do with this, what I think is this fascinating, this is why I turned back to Michael Mann's work, this framework to look at ideological power. And it seems to me that this is really an important terrain for us to explore further, to understand our times. Because how can we understand the rise of right populist politics, the potency of it today, across Europe and the United States, etc., without, exploring this terrain of ideological power? Ideological power, as Michael says, being this it derives from the fact that people crave for simple explanations when there's no evidence to back them up. But how this now has increased in its importance in the quadrilateral array of power with social media and AI and whatnot. For me, I find that really, fascinating, depressing, provoking, etc. But anyway, thank you very much, Michael. It's wonderful you're here with us.
Right.
Are you going to chair up here?
Yes, well, you have me right, basically. The quadrilateral theory. It is, of course, Eurocentrism. It's worse than that. It's British centrism, because that's where it happened.
Yeah.
And for no other reason. The timeliness of nature, I don't know if I've got that expression, if that's the perfect expression. But what I mean is that, nature's always been there in given quantities. And at certain points in time, that becomes relevant to economic development. So, people have argued, many people have argued, that coal is the basic feature of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. But that's accidental, and it's been there for centuries, and it's been exploited for centuries, actually, on a small scale. But there are others where it's much more recent. I mean, Scandinavia has forests, many, many forests, and if you burn certain of the firs, you get tar, and tar was the basic ingredient for ships, for holding the planks of wood together and for sealing the ship. So that forests had always been there, but suddenly Sweden can exploit them and become quite prosperous on them. And the British become, with the biggest navy, they become very dependent on tar. So it's, you know, nature is always there, but sometimes it becomes highly relevant to social development. That's obviously the case with precious metals, but there's many other features as well. I think that one thing that I didn't bring out properly, I mentioned 2% of the population being represented in Parliament, and that there's an estimate of that the total number of inventors might amount to as much as 4% of the population. So that it is, first of all, it's elites who are doing some things, and then it's this emerging middle class, which is still tiny, which is pioneering developments. And that raises a problem for standard economic arguments, which depend upon national statistics. And so, for example, when, what's the general growth guy, and I've forgotten. Well, anyway, some people have said that education in Britain was weak because the level of literacy among the national population remained pretty static through the period of the Industrial Revolution. But that's a measure based on your ability to sign your name in a marriage register or some other official document, which is a lousy predictor of real literacy. Some Dutch economic historians have developed instead counted the print runs, how much printing there is, and that as a measure of the amount of literacy relevant for inventing things. And that works very well. And the problem is it's only 2%, 4% of the population, whereas economists tend to search for Britain as a whole, and that's why they say that imperialism wasn't very profitable, because the poor sods down below didn't get anything at all from empire, but the elites who mattered, who had power, did. Ideological power, I've been at pains to say that isn't the same as culture. Culture is all our ideas, all our orientations, and there are in sociology there's a movement of cultural determinism, of people who argue that our ideas, our way of life, our culture is what matters. But the trouble is that's all embracing. It's what can you say about culture except that it's everywhere? And my notion of ideology is meaning systems that offer a plausible solution going beyond empirical reality. And I think that confines the notion to religions, major political movements, and the like.
Okay. Should I open it up for questions?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So questions. Do we have a microphone upstairs as well? Yes. Okay. So I'll take a few questions at once. Everybody's more shy this week. History. Yes. So we have. Let's take these two questions down here. and the gentleman who's extremely well dressed. So we'll do both questions downstairs and then we'll go up.
Hello. Hello, Professor. I just wanted to ask you, you emphasized the importance of ideology and Protestantism specifically in the growth of Britain. So in a way, if it could be said, a collective rebellion became a cultural phenomenon because you just differentiated between ideology and culture. I just wanted to know with reference to Samuel Huntington's paper of Clash of Civilizations, when does an ideology become a culture? And with respect to, say, the current status of cultural dogmatism in the East and the Middle Eastern countries, I just wanted to know your views on those as well.
Did you get the question?
No, I haven't understood the question.
Could you maybe...
Okay, sure. I guess a basic version of it would be, with respect to Samuel Huntington's paper of Clash of Civilizations, when does ideology become a culture? And could you please give a reference to it with respect to Southeast Asia as well as the Middle East?
We're going to take
We'll take a
questions
couple,
at a
maybe.
time.
All right.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for this interesting talk. So you mentioned like 4 sources of power. My question is related to the role of colonialism that plays in British Industrial Revolution. We just had a session this week about colonialism and colonial legacy. So many papers argue, especially British colonialism in India, kind of provides the market and also capital accumulation, which is kind of determinant for industrial revolution to happen in Britain. So I'm wondering what's your view on that, and what role does colonialism play in triggering industrial revolution?
Okay, thank you. And the gentleman upstairs.
Okay, so in the context of industrialization and imperialism, what source of power, ideological, political, economic, that you think is the most important? And do you think that the rise of industrial revolution and imperialism alter the balances between these powers?
Right. One of your questions is extremely important, which is, can we prioritize these 4? Is one of them more important than the others alike? And I think the answer to that is no, we can't. They all offer different things. They operate in different ways. Economic power is a very broadly diffused power that permeates people's everyday lives in a way that the other sources of social power don't generally do. But that doesn't mean that economic power is more important than the others, because ideological power tends to come in bursts. And though in those bursts, ideology is all important. But it's a different time frame, because most ideology in normal times, as it were, merely reinforces existing social structures and allows people to live at an everyday level, thinking that that life is worthwhile. And it's only on odd occasions, I mean, revolutionary occasions perhaps, that ideology becomes tremendously important. Military power is even more sudden, right? For the most part, militaries, they do internal repression in most historical societies, but in terms of war, they lay idle for much of the time and then are suddenly called into action. And wars can change fundamentally patterns of development. I think that they are, as in my example of the Dutch and Britain, Dutch were destroyed by wars. And that's the more normal feature. And I think the European land powers were also held back by that. What I was going to say then. Right, so the military tends to be very sudden and overwhelming and makes for really radical change. Okay, one thinks of World War II, the fundamental changes right across the world that led towards. And political power, well, that tends to be the most conservative one. That is, it's related to the power of political institutions over given territories. It's not very expansionist without military power backup. So they're all different. So I don't think you can simply prioritize. I think what you can do is what I've tried to do here, is to say that all four are necessary for explaining a major outcome. Except, of course, that I did concede in my last remarks that if you're trying to explain an economic outcome, perhaps more likely much of the explanation, the bulk of the explanation will be in processes of economic development. But I think that it needs the push of other things too.
I think there was that other question about colonialism.
Yeah.
Too. Yeah.
And then the clash of civilization as well.
Yeah. Well, I hope I've made clear that I think that British colonialism was benefited the wealthy in Britain, those represented in Parliament, and not only colonialism, but the costs of colonialism and war. They were, in effect, redistributed towards the rich. Of course, the impact on the people being colonized is quite another matter. I mean, I've got to say this, I think it's outrageous that Acemoglu and his collaborators said that settlers are good for the development of political institutions and modernity in general. Well, where you have settlers, you have ethnic cleansing on a massive scale in order for the settlers to take the land of the indigenous people. So to have that as a recommendation seems to me to be utterly bizarre, and considering that they work in the United States, it's kind of blind to the whole of American history, which is a settler country, which resulted in the almost total elimination of the native population.
And they just got the Nobel Prize.
Yeah. Yeah. The clash of civilizations. I've never really bought that. I mean, you can divide up the world in the broadest of terms. You know, there are Christian societies, though they don't have much core left, really. You have Islamic, etc., and you have obviously East Asian cultures, which are distinctive and different from the others. But I don't think that there's a struggle between these civilizations. I don't know where he got that from.
Okay, so more questions. I know there's a woman upstairs there. And the gentleman at the back, and then maybe we'll take both of you. Can we take 4 at once? Is that
Yeah.
just because they're so close to each
Sure.
other? Okay, so upstairs first.
Hello. I also have to briefly say that I was very excited for this lecture because I became familiar with your work when I was studying in Colombia like 5 years ago. And I just wanted to ask if this new vision changes at all your previous work on how the role and the functions of the state developed, and if this at all challenges those ideas.
Thank you very much. And the 2 questions here, and then the gentleman at the back as well.
Hi, I really enjoyed the lecture, but I was just interested what you said before about China and kind of India's emerging economies, and I was wondering whether you thought there was any like interesting parallels between the UK's Industrial Revolution and these emerging economies, and I suppose maybe more importantly whether there's any like distinctions as well.
Right behind you.
Hi, my question is a bit of a follow-up on the question around the prioritization of the 4 sources of power. And I guess my reflection from what we've been looking at in terms of colonialism and the impact that it has had on development at a global scale is that we seem to have arrived at a world where things are really, how do you say, they've diverged a lot, and there's a lot of inequality which seems to come from an initial act of violence, which is now resulted in a series of unequal interactions that just perpetuate themselves all the time. And I wonder whether it's your impression that the economic sources of power today are so strong and so tipped in one direction that the other sources of power would have to suffer a massive upheaval for actually change to happen and for development to happen. So I don't know whether that balance that appeared when Britain was developing, where you could see very clearly all of the influences, would now be more tipped towards the economic sources of power, because they seem to be so extreme at the moment.
Okay, and the gentleman at the back there. You can pass the, okay.
Thank you, Professor Mann, for the wonderful talk. When we see the different forces of power, we will see them existing in different states, but they tend to sort of vary in terms of form and structure. My question is, what would you say sort of conditions that explain why these structures of different sources of power may account for long-term positive structure change in some cases, whereas in other cases we may not see kind of, this transformation, or it may lead to stagnation? And my second question, just a follow-up, would you say that these different sources of social power, did they precede the Industrial Revolution, or they co-evolved with the Industrial Revolution? Thank you.
Okay, I've written them down in case we...
All right.
Me too.
Well, as far as China and other Asian powers are concerned, my model doesn't give you easy answers for the whole world. And indeed, I would, in terms of people working on contemporary and recent Chinese development, I would say only the world has changed a great deal. And you have to analyze the 4 sources of social power in the context in which, in the contemporary context. I don't think that this is a magic recipe for explaining all of human societies. I just think it's a kind of guide as to well, 2 things. It's a guide as to where you've got to look, where you've got to think about. Now, there are cases in which, if you're trying to explain, say, the Great Depression, you're not really going to introduce military power, except in terms of the consequences of World War I. And so, depending on the problem, you don't necessarily have all sources of power, or at least certainly not as of equivalent power. There's going to be some that are more powerful than others. It's, you know, you should just try and make sure that you have taken into account the four sources of power. Now, yeah, the global capitalism, that, you know, what you say has some force. The fact that states, even the most powerful states, can be outflanked by global organization, global capitalist organizations, is a new level of power for economies. I mean, one mustn't take it too far, and of course, if wars happen, that would be a refutation of what you're saying, because global capitalism is supposed to bring global integration, and yet it doesn't. And so I think your point works best for the advanced capitalist countries and for those areas where there is relative peace. But obviously, in the Middle East, there is, you know, military power is very important, and so is ideology. That in Israel-Palestine, there's two conflicting theories as to who the land belongs to. One of them is 2,000 years old, and the other one is 1,500 years old. The claims that they have from the river to the sea. So, you know, kind of ideology is very important in that case, and in various cases around the world. And of course, if trade wars go any further, well, wars could become, in the last instance of human societies altogether, if there is a major war between the United States and China, for example. And indeed, where there are wars all around the world, though of different sizes and the like, that does also restrain the rule of economic power. And what were my memory is no longer...
So the first question was whether this changes your understanding of kind of the development of state power and infrastructural power. Like how have this project shaped your old thinking about that? And then there was also a question...
Well, why don't we stick with you for one minute?
Okay.
Oh, right. Well, I still, although I didn't bring it out today, I still use the distinction between despotic and infrastructural power, and I'd say that counter to North, who puts his focus on representative government as a precursor of growth, as a stimulus to growth. I say no, it's much more infrastructural power. It's about solidifying the dominant classes of society and they are directly represented in Parliament alongside the King's ministers. So this is a state which is great control of its land because of the class solidarity, the final political solutions to the struggles of the 16th and the 17th centuries had produced. So I'm still using the notion of despotic infrastructural power, and I'm saying that despotic power doesn't matter as much to the development of capitalism as many economists say. What matters rather more than that is the development of a cohesive state which can tax and borrow and pursue policy in a way that unites people who matter, which is the dominant classes.
And then the last question was about sort of why, I hope I'm going to capture it, why similar kinds of processes like war or like the kind of ideological process you talked about can lead to productive outcomes in some and completely destructive outcomes in others. And he also had this question about, you know, the development of the sources of social power co-evolving with capitalism, I think was the second question.
Did they proceed or?
Yeah.
Right, so the first
Is why does war lead to these positive outcomes in some cases and destructive?
Well, as I argued in my book on wars, kind of 80% of wars don't do anyone any good. Either they are stalemates, no one wins, or they turns out there are no gains to be made of any significance. So that very few wars are productive in that sense. And indeed, in this case, Patrick O'Brien, who's a retired professor here of economic history, he demonstrated years ago that only the British and Dutch empires made any money for the countries concerned, that none of the others did. So their wars, their colonialism was a hindrance to them. Now, I've qualified that a bit by saying that the Dutch won, it worked for a period, and then they suffered the devastation of wars, and the Dutch state became bankrupt as a result of the cost of wars. And only in the case of the British did it do much good. And it's, you know, I'm not, it did them some good, it didn't do the colonies any good. It was a factor in the development of the Industrial Revolution. That's quite unusual.
And then there was about the co-development of the sources with capitalism.
Yes. Is this a question about the timing of them? Right. Well, I said that the oldest features in Europe, including England, were wars and Christendom. Christendom breaks apart at the moment that capitalism is emerging. And so in the relationship between capitalism and religion, in this case Protestantism, it's impossible to say that one came before the other and therefore caused the other. And their relationship is quite important, and I think I have produced some evidence that Protestantism continues to be of some importance. I mean, the Weber v. Marx debate is a bit artificial, since Weber said at the end of the Protestant ethic, he says, I've shown one particular causal connection, that a correlation between Calvinist virtues and spirit of capitalism, but it would be necessary for a complete explanation to study other aspects, including more material context. Marxists say it's the other way around, that capitalism produces Protestantism, which I don't think is true because they happen at the same time. So there's an interaction between them. And I think that the Protestant influence makes a difference in certain ways. Makes a difference in terms of literacy and in terms of the endurance of the scientific revolution in Protestant countries and its impact on the non-conformists.
Okay, I'm going to take some more questions, and I think this will be the last round of questions. So if you're feeling shy, please put up your hand. Okay, so we have one question down here, and we have a question. Oh, let's go to the lady upstairs, because and we'll go with her first. And then the lady over there in the white jumping wrap.
Should I? Yes. Yeah. So I had two questions, one around ideology and another one around capitalism and imperialism. The first one around ideology is really, how do you see ideology where does it come from in a way? And where does it come from? Is it always the elite kind of trying to legitimize their power, or does it happen in different ways? And the second one around capitalism and imperialism, what does it mean if those two are necessarily correlated? What does it mean for people, for countries that wants to develop within the capitalist framework?
You mean if they're not an imperial power?
Yes, if they're unless they go through the imperial kind of ideology, how do they do to develop within capitalism?
Okay, and we'll go
Oh, and maybe just a question around ideology, sorry. Why does an ideology stick around and another one fall? And what makes an ideology kind of die eventually?
Okay, and the gentleman downstairs.
Yes, thank you for the talk. My question is, you've presented these 4 forms of power, and your talk seems to imply that the Industrial Revolution is, in a sense, an alignment of all 4, or can be explained as an extraordinary alignment of these 4 forces. So would you say that it's a general pattern of sort of phase transitions in society, that you have at least 2 of these forces aligning, or can any individual source on its own already explain some really substantive shift in social structures?
Okay, and the lady upstairs.
Yes. Hi, thank you for the lecture. My question was directed to how this model can apply, instead of retroactively, proactively, because we have seen how the 4 different sources kind of merged together to generate this one perfect storm from the Industrial Revolution in the UK. However, is there any sort of general nice equilibrium we can reach by analyzing this to then see how we could replicate that in another case? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Ideological power. Well, there are different, I distinguish between transcendent, cohesive, and conservative ideologies. Transcendent ideologies are those that emerge in times of crisis where existing ideologies just don't seem to work. And so different claims are made. with a kind of a degree of plausibility about an explanation of what's wrong and how it would be put right. And that would certainly apply to most religions. That is their period of emergence. Now, but ideologies, and that's a transcendent ideology, transcends existing social structures and sets out a new reality. Immanent ideologies are those that just reinforce existing social groups, but not the ruling institutions of society. And conservative ones are the legitimizing ideologies of groups who already have power. So most of the ideology we have around is legitimating present social structures and the power of those who possess more power. But that falls apart from time to time in revolutions, and the Industrial Revolution was a perfect storm, very unusual in history. I mean, global historians compare it only to the Neolithic Revolution, about which we know very, very little. So there are different kinds of ideology, and some are more frequent than others. What else was there?
So why does one stick around, and why do others die out?
Well, you know,
they're asking you very difficult questions.
Well, they stick around if they seem to continue providing plausible answers to the meaning of life and what morality is. And obviously there are different ideologies at work. I mean, there are various ideological movements in the United States at present, all with the ability to attract thousands of people, but none of them capturing the country as a whole. So they will continue. If we're talking about transcendent ideologies, which are kind of revolutionary, they will, existing ideologies will maintain themselves as long as they seem to offer a plausible context and enable you to get on with your everyday life in a way that's not extremely troubling. And when present-day societies, when things seem not to be working, that's when ideologies emerge. And that's obviously the case with the Trumpite movement in the United States, where people in rural and small towns feel that they're not getting their fair share of the rewards of progress, and have been energized by a charismatic leader. They have proved a very effective force in American society. You're asking me to pronounce on everything.
Yes.
Okay, so there was a question about alignment.
Oh, that was the one about the alignment of the different sources of power to produce the perfect storm, was the way it was expressed. Who said that? But yes. So alignment is a term that suggests that they become aligned one to another, and each is maintained, right? What I want to suggest by conjunctures
is it's kind of conjuncture is a kind of, to some degree, accidental, but only to some degree. It is the coming together of two lines of development which don't easily align with each other, which the consequence is there's a new solution from this conjunction. And so that's what I've tried to suggest.
And I guess they're independent processes that can also, you know, they have different logics of their own.
Yes,
So
yes, they each have they have a distinct logic, but that gets disrupted or reinforced, or it can result in cycles. So that the Malthusian cycle, which makes a great deal of sense over much of human history, is one where you have agricultural production, population size, and they come together in a highly disjunctive way when population is greater than the agricultural productivity. And so you have famine, starvation, other outcomes. So that's not a happy case.
There was this one other
there
question.
was about proactive.
Yeah.
But do you want to come into that
No,
question?
let
the proactive question. Okay.
Let Professor Mann answer that one. And now there's one thing I can
Okay.
add.
So there was the final question about, you know, what can we learn for this? Can we use this model in a kind of proactive, or I guess
To
intentional
get a nice
way?
equilibrium to change the world in some kind of
Yeah.
positive way. I think that was your question, wasn't it?
Or it's
Whoever
like,
asked it.
can the model be seen as a way of replicating? Yeah.
I don't think I'm that ambitious. I know that it would be nice if I could say now, and the problem of contemporary development in the world can derive from the argument that I have made. Similar processes, but obviously no, they're not similar processes. Things have changed considerably. I mean, one way in which they've changed considerably is the highly successful highly economically successful countries are perfectly visible to all of the other cases, whereas the case that I looked at was where first two countries and then one deviated from the rest of the world. So, you know, that's one of the ways in which things are different, and different from much of the world. War is not as regular, as persistent, as normal an outcome as it was in the European context. Because it was so regular, it wasn't without its rules. Countries concerned were the most devastating war in the period that I'm looking at was the 30 Years' War, which was a religious war in the 1618 to 1648. It was a religious war, and after that, the powers decided to, and it was terrible. I mean, 40% of the population of present-day Germany died, and the powers decided to have more governed war as a consequence. Well, we don't have that, really. And the wars that emerge are now, they're not a systemic feature of continents as it was in Europe.
Do you want to come in on that last question, James?
I can come in on that and also just say something about India-China, because several people asked about that, and I said something in my discussant comments about that. But I mean, I imagine, you know, the lethal power today, as you describe military power being lethal power to kill, it is a very threatening part of our reality today, particularly since the kind of rules of war that emerged out of past contests, etc., that maintained and helped to reproduce capitalist economies have really been thrown aside to a large extent. So, you know, even the United States, when it decides to go and exercise this extraordinary lethal power, it breaks whatever rules we had devised over time to kind of control it. And I would say now in the Middle East and Israel's projection of lethal power has kind of broken the rules that govern somehow the deployment of this. So it becomes and Russia too, and Ukraine, it becomes very dangerous, I guess, looking forward. You know, people, in your original work, I mean, so rich, you talked about the way in which all these sources of, or at least military, economic, and ideological power could be produced within society or within the state. And some of what we see is the process of ceding power from society to the state, or the state, you know, grabbing it back coercively. And I think it's kind of interesting, that idea, if we're looking at how has power been working itself out in China and India. And, you know, in all four sources of power can provide a really powerful, I think, a really sharp kind of lens in which to look at changing China and India. And particularly when we see power shifting perhaps back and shifting back between society and the state. So I think there's a lot to say here. And we'll take it up in my course anyway later on. But yeah, I'm really, if I can, as a discussant, say thank you very much. Very stimulating discussion.
Okay. So I want to thank Michael Mann and James for the great discussion today. What I kind of want you guys really to take away from this talk is on the screen here, the in-between of very deterministic models of development and just endless multi-causality, right? We don't want to just describe what is happening. We want to theorize it, but we don't want to be deterministic about one thing leading to another thing. And just to talk about that kind of conjunctural aspect of development and the kind of, is it alignment or conjuncture? Like if I think about this in relation to African economies, right? They're in these long-term business cycles. What's happening in the rest of the world in terms of commodity demand, right? In terms of access to credit, in terms of policy space. Then thinking about the kind of decline of US power, the kind of conflicts that are breaking out across the Sahel right now, thinking within each country there's kind of political processes going on. So I think it's really kind of a rich framework for thinking about how these different kinds of processes play out and interconnect with one another. And I think especially in the DS degree, we really want you to get away from